Welcome to Resounding, a podcast exploring the power of the arts in advocacy and in action. We talk with artists and activists, taking a deep dive into questions surrounding the causes of displacement, the strength and the vulnerability of people on the move, and the potential of the arts to shine a light on social injustice and to impact people's lives for the better. My name is Laura Hassler, and this episode I spoke to John and Lizzi Swatland, the creators of Scattered People, a moving documentary about how a community of musicians rallied to support refugees arriving in Australia. A story about music telling people stories, and a film telling about the power of music to change lives and restore hope. In this conversation, John and Lizzi shared their passion, enthusiasm, and sense of determination in using the arts to challenge the unjust treatment of refugees around the world. Very warm welcome, John and Lizzi Swatland, to this issue of Resounding on. People will be listening to it later, but we're talking to each other on June 20th, which is the International Day of the Refugee. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, you for having
Laura.
us. Yeah.
So we met in 2017, as I remember, when I was in Australia on a speaking tour, and you hosted me very generously, and you were in the middle of, or in the process of, working on the Scattered People film. And that's what we're talking about today, is this film, Scattered People. Can you tell us something about then, where you were then, and maybe then flash back to how you started with this?
Sure. We actually were probably in the end stages of collecting all the interviews that we wanted for this film. It started about probably 6, 7, 8 years ago now. So it was about 6 years before it's released. We actually finally released it in 2021. And when you arrived, we had quite a lot of the interviews organised. We had about 40 interviews in the end, which is quite a lot for a short documentary. The story started probably, we can go back to the story at the beginning, and that was... I'm actually a chiropractor, and Lizzi is a teacher's aide. And so this isn't our main occupation. And I had a patient on the table named Robbie James, who is the lead guitar of a rock group in Australia, rock pop group called Gangajang. And very well known in Australia. It had one huge hit, which is still very, very popular and played regularly. And basically, I asked him what he was doing musically. He was down on the table getting his adjustment, and he said, "I'm making an album with people seeking asylum." Really grabbed my interest, yeah, and I thought, that's interesting, because we'd been following it politically and thinking something doesn't sound right there in Australia with the way the people were being used, the asylum seekers. We would always get a negative viewpoint from the government. So we wanted to actually look into it a bit further. So I asked him if we could help him to promote the album when it came out with a short video, because Lizzi and I were doing a little bit of work with video and interviews at the time with another group who we were with.
So Robbie was doing the album for the asylum seekers because he actually went into BITA, which is the detention centre in Brisbane. We knew nothing about it, nothing. So he then introduced us to Brian.
Okay, right. So let's then wind back. Tell us a little bit about the detention center in Brisbane, and about Brian, and about how this idea started. The idea being to sing with asylum seekers who were in detention in Australia. That was the first idea, right?
Yes, it started back in about 1999, 98, and Brian was working for Lifeline, which is a community counselling service, but they also have a community building project, and Brian was the leader of that project, and they heard there were some asylum seekers being kept at the transit accommodation. It's Brisbane International Transit Accommodation, BITA is the name of the place. And it was being used to keep people seeking asylum. And they didn't even know that it was there. And they were working with Amnesty International and other humanitarian organisations, deciding what to do about this problem, the issue of asylum seekers. And they heard they were being kept in Baita. And the story of the film basically shows how they started to take music into, I don't know if we tell that story in depth, because that's in the film and we want people to see the film.
Right.
But Brian actually took some musicians into the detention centre, and Robbie James was part of that group of musicians. Brian Prokopas, yes.
Who was maybe the leader of the Scattered People Project?
Yes, we call him the father.
Who was a professional working for a social work organization, and he also a musician. Am I saying this correctly?
Yes, correct. Yes, okay. Absolutely.
Through his organization, he found out about this center, and somehow as a musician, he got in.
Yeah, music took him in. It was really interesting. They went in, he actually phoned the people there, which is in the film, and said, hey, we'd like to come and help these people that you have there. And they said no. So they phoned a week later and said, we'd like to bring music in. And they said yes. So for years, they went in and really helped these people who were obviously very lost, and we don't have to go into that, but music helped them, absolutely helped them, from writing all their stories and turning them into songs. So all the stories of these wonderful people, they turned into songs, they made music, and they all sang together.
And these were people who had come from many different places, fleeing war or whatever they were fleeing. Who ends up in Australia? Which people from which places end up in Australia?
Yeah, a lot of people from Iran, from Iraq. There was also Eritrea, and there was Sri Lankan.
Yes, Sri Lanka.
Sri Lankan and Tamils. And many of these people were from different sides of the conflict in different ways. Sudanese were there. And originally, I think Brian mentioned people from Chile as well. That was in the early days. And they're from all different backgrounds. So what they did is they took their stories, wrote them down, put them into song, and played them back to them, so they could sing out and experience how they were being heard, and actually express that as well at the same time. And it was a safe place for those feelings to be explored and to be expressed and to be felt and to be shared. So it was very healing for them in that small environment of the Baita Detention Centre.
Very interesting that, we have this too with Musicians Without Borders, that sometimes if you are offering music, you can kind of fly under the radar. And maybe get into places that you might not be able to get into if you present your work with using different words. But it only being music. I think that often authorities don't realize how powerful this art form is to connect people and to, as you say, offer a safe space where stories can be told. And then I find it so interesting that they took the Australian musicians took people's stories and turned them into songs, and then came back and sung those songs for them. That's how it started, and then invited them to join in singing. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, correct.
It was with them. The purpose was not to give them anything, but to just play songs, just set up and play songs, play music, and then they'd hand over their guitars. And there are some beautiful stories in the film about, handing over the guitars and the songs that they would hear back, and they could hear, and even not knowing the words, what the song was about. And inevitably there would be about love songs and about home and that sort of thing.
There was a story which is very beautiful about this little girl with her mum, and this little girl was absolutely terrified, and she wouldn't talk, she wouldn't do anything, and week after week they'd go in. And then eventually this little girl, she started to brighten up a bit, and then she started to clap, didn't she? And then eventually, after weeks of them going in there, and they never asked them to join in. They said they just went there and played music. Whoever wanted to join in could. Some got up and danced. But this little girl, after many, many weeks, she then started to sing and speak and join in. So music, look what music does, the healing power of music.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this project started when, in the 90s already?
Late 90s, yeah.
1999, I think.
And I think they didn't have a name for it then, but someone came up with the name Scattered People when they were putting out their first album, and it was well received and appreciated. And I think there was 3 waves of refugees. That was the first wave back in 2002, I believe. Yeah, so it just evolved as it was, and the theme of music attracted musicians. And I think one of the things that inspired us about telling this story was that one of the ethos of the whole organisation, not really organisation, it was very loose. There were musicians. The band was quite loose and changing all the time, as bands do, but the ethos was of unconditional acceptance and creating a space of healing. And there was a lot of listening, and there was a lot of sensitivity and gentleness, and extending a hand and just walking alongside people.
Friendship.
Yeah. And the band called themselves a band of kindred spirits. And that's really describes the way they are. And that was the theme of the story. And actually, we actually carried that through into the filmmaking. We wanted everything that came through on the film to have that sense of what the band was about, because it was so successful. It worked. It opened people up. It created safe space. It created community, and a place where people could be welcomed.
When John says community, after they were released from Biter, after an extended time, they still wanted to continue with the music. Yeah. So they went to a community centre, a local one in Brisbane, and so they would go there once a week and join, and anyone could go along who wanted to go along, and the band would be there every week, and whoever turned up, fine, but they would be there and sing. Yeah.
Also very interesting that both this turning up all the time, the musicians, the core of Australian musicians were always there every week, and people turned up and joined. And then I saw in the short to the film, and also in the film itself, that actually produced a rather high quality music performing group, and really beautiful to listen to. And so I find it very interesting that not only this kind of the combination of like a social setting where people can feel safe and accepted and can tell their stories and can also hear their stories back, so feel listened to, but also then putting that on a stage and telling the story to a larger audience. And can you talk about that a little bit, both in terms of the group and also what you're doing with this film about telling this story and trying to impact the narrative in Australia about people seeking refuge?
I think the band itself, because they're such good friends anyway, they became family, if you like, and friends. So whenever there was something happening in Brisbane, particularly because they're all from Brisbane, in Queensland here, they would just get together, and whenever they wanted to perform, they'd just rock up and say, okay, and John and I were very lucky because we would obviously say, we want to do some filming. Can you come to such and such a place where they're having a gig or a concert? And again, it was awareness of refugees, and we rattle them together and we'd be there, and it was great. So we could actually film them performing as well as them then having more awareness in wherever we were. So
you also became kind of agent for them in some way too.
In some respects, it was being a bit of a shepherdess, actually. It was quite funny trying to round them up, and it was a lot of fun. But going back to your original question, I think that once we knew what Brian was doing, and then we said, well, do you have any people seeking asylum that we can actually interview? Because that's really important for the story. And he said, well, you know, they're very shy and they don't sometimes like talking about their journey,
Sure.
where they are. But anyway, he introduced us to this gorgeous young man, Mas, who lived in Brisbane with his father. When we met him, that was the turning point of this whole film making. We interviewed him in his home. And after we spoke with him, he'd made us this amazing lunch. And of course, there was sweets, lollies everywhere and welcoming, just beautiful people. And when we were driving back home, I couldn't stop crying. John didn't speak a word. It's about an hour's drive from where we live down on the Gold Coast. And we thought, gosh, you know, this was the turning point. Do we just carry on with our lives? Do we just do this little album promotion for Robbie? Or what else could we do? And we decided in that moment we have to do more. And that was the turning point to make the film.
And to tie that in with the performing, he was the one who was left really. Saha had moved, the other refugee asylum seeker in the film had moved to Melbourne, so she only came up a few times. But Masood would always turn up. But there was one performance they did. I hear what you're saying about the art of the whole experience. There was the stories, there was the music, there was the performance, and they always wanted to include a person seeking asylum in the band if they could. There should be representation there. But a lot of them had eventually moved on into their own lives, and they didn't want to be a part of that anymore because it was going backwards, because they wanted to be integrated into Australia. And difficult as it was, but they wanted to move on from that experience. But there was actually one time where they had a painter, an artist, who, as they were doing the concert, the painter was painting a large picture behind them, and he was very fast at his work, and in the end they auctioned that off to somebody. So that was part of the process. So they tried to include the art of that, and they were all great musicians. So there was a great synergy amongst the group.
So now we have music, film, painting. Talk about what you've learned about the power of the arts to persuade and to tell stories in disarming ways that maybe we don't hear in the news and in the newspapers and so forth. What's special about your work, our work, all the whole work of Art 27, all people who are all trying to tell these stories through arts and make changes through arts?
That's a big one, and that's something we learned as we went along. We actually watched quite a lot of other refugee and asylum seeker movies, and some were political, some were legal. They're all incredibly good and informative, but the ones that moved us most were the stories. And we knew that music was a great vehicle for opening people's hearts and, different parts of their brain and that sort of thing. So the idea was that we tell the story through music and through using their own voice. The interviews with Mas and Saha were important. They would tell their stories. So it was empowering for them. They would feel they were heard. They would tell their story to the Australian people. That was the initial desire. Basically, that synergy of the music, the stories, the image, the filming, we tried to make it as artistic as we could. We chose songs which had lyrics which are the themes that were being expressed in the story and needed to touch a certain point. And we must give really full thanks and gratitude to our editor, Lindy Harrison, who is a very experienced editor, because we ended up with 40 interviews, as I said, and about 7 concerts and all this footage and a lot of songs and Lindy came up to us 2 weeks every 6 months or so from Sydney, and she would take over my office and edit this rough cut and put it together. And she actually found the story in all of that. She was the Michelangelo seeing the image in the block of marble.
We love music. We go to live shows, all these, big events, and we love certain, obviously, musicians. So we sent out an email to all musicians that we loved in Australia, thinking, what the heck? And most of them came back and said, yes, they wanted to be part of it. Amazing. So we were blown away by that.
That is amazing. I was going to ask you how you got all these big name musicians involved, all either performing or quoting something relevant at exactly the right moment, and then weaving that into the stories from the asylum seekers. But it stood out to me, like, how did you get Michael Franti?
I know. Look, I love Michael Franti, always had, and knew he was a huge humanitarian. And I said to John, wouldn't it be great if we got Michael Franti? And you wouldn't believe it, he was doing a concert here in Australia, just at the right timing, a couple of months away from, so quickly emailed his management in the US, and sure enough came back and said, no, we'd really love to do that. He's playing at blah, blah, blah. So we went up there with our cameras and
so just ask, but what we found out was that many of these musicians are very political. They're very socially aware, and they've often come from difficult circumstances. John Butler is one who's world famous now. He's an excellent musician and a long experience as an activist and a humanitarian, and Michael Franti, of course. But all of them had their ideas, and some of them who weren't really included so much in the film were the ones who were really politically so passionate about seeing change happen in our country, because the context is that our government was doing terrible things to refugees with offshore detention. So the background is we were motivated to have this change happen, to make change or be part of the change, but by telling a positive story, one that would inspire people, one that would open their hearts, whatever side of the fence they were on. There was the beautiful musicians. Part of the reason for asking them to be part of it was because of their big names. And they would draw cards, but also their experience. And then we got to ask them about their viewpoint on music, their experience with music, how it had changed them, and ask different questions. They all answered in different ways, which are in the film.
John, you're a chiropractor. Lizzie, you're an educator. Do you now identify as filmmakers?
We're incredibly proud. And when we had one of the screenings in Brisbane, for some reason, they always used to put us at the front to go straight into Q&A. And this particular evening, it was up the back. And we thought, this would take a while to go all the way down. It was a full house. And then I'm a very emotional person, very sensitive and emotional. And I got really emotional because I could see down on it all. And I thought, wow, we've done this. And it was the first time I felt proud. But this is 5-6 years later. And now I just feel incredible gratitude that we did keep going. There were times when we thought, what the heck are we doing? I'd be incredibly overwhelmed, both of us, because we're still working full time. And it was the passion that drove us, and inspired by people like Sahar Mas. We met many others on the way too. And to make a difference, to create that space to make a difference. And for me, anybody can do it. It's the passion, the will to drive whatever it is, whether it's through music, through film, through podcasts, through any social media. Because for me, we have the power. It's the people power, not the politics. We didn't want to go political at the end of the day, but we have the power. It's the people to say, hey, we want change.
But in the end, it's a personal story, and that is a political thing. So it speaks, but it speaks quietly. That's more in the subtext.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think for me, it grew slowly. We had basic skills at the beginning, but we learnt them as we went along. And when we didn't know, we asked for help. And we got great help from our filmmaking community in Australia. We didn't get much funding. We didn't get any funding and support from the government. And it wasn't because of the nature of the film, because other films were getting accepted for funding, but we just didn't have any experience.
Right.
And even though we showed them what we had, and it was okay, but they wouldn't go the next step.
Didn't tick all the boxes.
No.
No.
So in the end, we had to fund it ourselves for the first few years, which is a certain amount every year, which was doable for us. But in the end, we had to pay for the rights of the music, which is very expensive. I don't know if you had any, you probably have had experience with that. It's incredibly expensive. So we had to find a supporter, a benefactor. And in the end, we found one who was a friend of a friend who we knew supported projects. And we showed him our trailer, our pitch trailer. We made a beautiful pitch trailer with a professional company.
Yeah.
And we showed it to him, and he had a tear in his eye and said,
yes,
I'll give you the money for the next step. So this happened about 3 years in a row when he gave us a bit of money each year, quite a lot of money, to pay for the rights. So we actually can take the film into education, into other areas.
And John, you just said about telling the story in a different way, not politics, but it is political. Can you talk a little bit about the situation of refugees in Australia then and now?
Well, the situation in Australia for refugees at that time, for people seeking asylum, was very poor. And even refugees, our intake was going down. We had a right of centre government who basically since 2002 made people fearful of that. They presented them in a way. We had something called the Children Overboard affair, which was when some people seeking asylum on a boat were coming to Australia. The story was that they threw their kids overboard so that they would be picked up by the Australian Navy. And in the end, that wasn't true, but that stuck in people's mind. And then we had the Tampa affair, which is where a large Norwegian trawler picked up asylum seekers that was taking them to Christmas Island, and we wouldn't let them dock. But this was the attitude of the government. And we thought, why aren't we've signed the Refugee Convention, and we're original signatories, so we should be supporting them. What's happened? Well, why are we different? What's changed? So that was the backdrop, and we were sending people off to Nauru and Manus, which are two islands in Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, and keeping them in terrible circumstances, and it was costing us $1 billion a year to do this. And through the interviews with our lovely interviewees, we realised that this wasn't the case that was going on, so we needed to tell that story.
The scary thing was, from far we can see clouds and something rainy really far. It looked like painting. But when our boat go inside the rain, everything's changed.
When I was on the boat, I didn't have any hope, to be honest. I believed I can die, I can be alive. That's 50-50. Someone just yelled, "Oh, I can see the Australian Navy." They came with boats, and after that, transferred us to the Christmas Island. And that stage, my life was stopped.
When I arrived to Christmas Island and see the position there, I said, whoa, it's the same, or maybe terrible than Iran.
At the moment, many of the people from Manus and Nauru have been brought to Australia. There's still about 110, 115 on those islands, but many of them have relationships with the locals, and they're probably staying there. And the last of the people that have been brought across, of about 2,500, I think it was at one stage, they've been brought to Australia under a medical evacuation program, and we've said they'll never be settled in Australia. That's the political, both sides of the government have said that, so they're in the process of being sent to Canada. The Refugee Council of Australia is raising money. They've raised $5.3 million now to help send people to Canada. So that's not even government funded. These are people that Australia won't take because that's a deterrent. But people who come to Australia by boat will not be settled in Australia. That's what the government has said. But it is quite an Australian story, but it could travel internationally. The music is beautiful, especially the Scattered People music. I mean, it stands up alongside the professional musicians very well.
Absolutely.
The point is, at that stage, when we started the film, no one was hearing those stories from these people. They were being shut down. There was a fear. No one from Manisul Nauru working there, sent there to work to look after them, was allowed to talk when they came back. Yeah. They had non-disclosure statements. It was
doctors, nurses, they weren't allowed to speak at all about what was really going on. Otherwise, they'd be, whatever they do, strip them of their, it was just horrific. And we didn't know any of this. So we learned so much. We were just horrified, absolutely horrified. We thought, no, something needs to happen. So that was the other thing that, we've had, 70 screenings since
nearly 80,
which have been in schools, universities, libraries. Very proud we did one in a brewery. So we've had screenings, everywhere, and of course in cinemas and movie houses.
Great.
And my passion was always obviously education. So we've only just this week released it out into the education. So every school, college, university in Australia has access to actually put that in their schools. It's M-rated, so it's unfortunately they have rated it M, which is senior students. However, we do know that schools of younger, in grade 7s and 8s, have watched it, and they were really moved by it and went running home and said, Mum and Dad, you have to see this film. So the school then re-screened it for the parents a week later.
Oh, amazing. Well, it's wonderful that you've had such great exposure. And you're right, John, it is about Australia, but I mean, it's also a story that is recognizable in many, many other places, I think. And as you said, the music is amazing. It's beautiful. And it's a very big story. I hope that we can get it to Europe and to the US and to Canada and to everywhere. It's so interesting to see how here we are. Our producer is in the UK. I'm outside of Amsterdam. You're on the Gold Coast in Australia, and we're having this conversation. And I think it's almost a sort of metaphor for the ways in which the arts can interact and activists can interact, and we need to. So I think this film needs to be seen all over the world. And I sincerely hope, I also hope that everybody who's listening will look up Scattered People, the website, which is can you say the address so that people can find it and find some information about it, and also look at at least at the trailer?
Sure, scatteredpeoplefilm.org. And I think I'm pretty sure our email is there as well. Or if people want our email, they can certainly get that through you, and we're happy to respond. They can sign up on the website for our newsletter, and we have a Facebook as well. Yeah, if people want to contact us, we're certainly happy to, help them with their projects in some way.
Absolutely.
With distribution is another thing. Distributing the film was a big thing. So we ended up distributing it through the organizations, the refugee and asylum seeker organizations. So we would just turn up and they would show the film, but they would do that because the film has to find a place to play. And we couldn't get onto the national broadcasters at the time, which we have now. There's a limited theatre run, so anywhere the film can be shown, if anyone has any ideas, please, feel free to contact us.
John and Lizzi Swatland, thank you so very much for this conversation.
Thank you for having us, Laura. Lovely, lovely to chat with you too.
Thanks, Laura. Wonderful. Bye.
Resounding is brought to you by the Art27 Network, a network of like-minded initiatives using art and culture to respond to the ongoing crisis of displacement of human beings in Europe and around the world. To find out more and to join our growing network, you can visit our website art27.art or follow us on Facebook at art27. This podcast was produced and edited by Ed Holland. The theme tune was written by Matteo Gallesi in collaboration with Synca. Thank you for listening.